The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Florence as Lorenzo walked through the streets where Niccolo Machiavelli once tread. In his hands he carried a worn leather journal, its pages filled with observations that would have made the great political theorist himself proud. The weight of centuries pressed upon his shoulders. Generations of his family had lived modest lives, content with their station, never daring to reach beyond the boundaries set by circumstance and tradition. But Lorenzo was different. He had studied the works of Machiavelli not merely as historical curiosities, but as a blueprint for transcendence. The concept of achieving the pinnacle that one's lineage has never reached is not merely about personal ambition. It is about understanding the fundamental nature of power, influence, and human psychology that Machiavelli so brilliantly articulated in his seminal works. It requires a departure from the comfortable mediocrity that often defines generational patterns, demanding instead a strategic approach to life that combines cunning, virtue, and an unflinching understanding of human nature. Machiavelli's wisdom teaches us that fortune favors the bold. But boldness alone is insufficient. One must possess what he termed virtue, not virtue in the moral sense, but the ability to adapt, to read circumstances correctly, and to act decisively when opportunity presents itself. Lorenzo had internalized this lesson during his years of study, watching as his contemporaries remained trapped in the same cycles that had defined their ancestors. They worked the same trades, held the same limited aspirations, and accepted the same constraints that had governed their families for generations. The first principle of achieving unprecedented heights within one's lineage is the recognition that traditional paths are, by definition, insufficient. If previous generations had possessed the knowledge, skills, or circumstances necessary to reach greater heights, they would have done so. Therefore, one must seek new knowledge, develop new skills, and create new circumstances. This is where Machiavelli's teachings become particularly relevant, as he understood that success often requires operating outside conventional frameworks. Lorenzo's transformation began with a simple but profound realization. His family's history of modest achievement was not a limitation imposed by fate, but rather the result of adherence to strategies that were fundamentally inadequate for significant advancement. His grandfather had been a craftsman, skilled but bound by the limitations of his guild. His father had followed the same path, perhaps with slightly better results, but still confined within the same basic framework. The family narrative was one of incremental improvement within narrow bounds, a story that Machiavelli would have recognized as lacking the boldness necessary for true transformation. The study of power dynamics, as outlined in The Prince, reveals that most individuals underestimate their capacity for influence and change. They accept the structures around them as immutable when, in reality, these structures are maintained by consensus and habit rather than absolute necessity. Rolero began to see the world through Machiavellian eyes, recognizing that every social, economic, and political arrangement represented opportunities for those willing to understand and manipulate the underlying forces. One of Machiavelli's most profound insights concerns the relationship between appearance and reality. He understood that perception often matters more than objective truth, and that skillful management of one's image and reputation could open doors that raw talent alone might never unlock. Lorenzo applied this principle systematically, studying not just what successful people did, but how they presented themselves, how they communicated, and how they positioned themselves within existing power structures. The traditional approach to family advancement typically involves working within established systems, pursuing education through conventional channels, seeking employment within existing organizations, and hoping that diligent effort will eventually be rewarded with modest promotion. This approach, while honorable, is fundamentally limited because it accepts the framework created by others rather than seeking to create new frameworks. Machiavelli's approach was different. He advocated for understanding the true nature of power and then positioning oneself to benefit from that understanding. Lorenzo's first major departure from family tradition came when he chose to study the behavior of influential people rather than simply studying subjects that were considered academically respectable. He spent months observing how successful entrepreneurs, politicians, and cultural figures operated. He noted their communication patterns, their strategic alliances, their timing, and their ability to create and exploit opportunities. This observational approach, reminiscent of Machiavelli's own method, revealed patterns that were invisible to those who remained focused solely on traditional metrics of achievement. The concept of new modes and orders, which Machiavelli discussed extensively, becomes crucial when attempting to transcend generational limitations. Most families operate according to inherited assumptions about what is possible, what is appropriate, and what methods are likely to succeed. These assumptions, passed down through generations, create invisible boundaries that limit potential. Breaking through requires not just individual effort, but a fundamental reconceptualization of the relationship between individual agency and social structures. Lorenzo discovered that his family's modest achievements were not the result of limited intelligence or capability, but rather the result of limited imagination and strategic thinking. Previous generations had accepted the prevailing narratives about social mobility. They had worked hard within these narratives, achieving respectable but unremarkable results. Lorenzo realized that transcending these limitations would require creating new narratives and new strategies. Machiavelli's understanding of fortuna, the role of chance and circumstances in human affairs, provides crucial insight for those seeking to achieve unprecedented heights. He recognized that while we cannot control all the factors that influence our success, we can position ourselves to benefit when favorable circumstances arise. More importantly, we can actively work to create favorable circumstances rather than simply waiting for them to occur naturally. The traditional family approach to opportunity is largely passive. Education is pursued in the hope that it will lead to better employment. Skills are developed in the expectation that they will eventually be recognized and rewarded. Networks are built gradually through shared activities and mutual interests. This approach, while not without merit, fails to account for the dynamic and competitive nature of advancement in complex societies. Lorenzo understood that achieving the pinnacle his lineage had never reached would require a more active and strategic approach to opportunity creation. One of the most significant barriers to transcending generational limitations is the tendency to seek approval and validation from those who represent the current family standard of achievement. Lorenzo's parents, while supportive of his ambitions, could not fully comprehend or endorse strategies that diverged significantly from their own experience. Their advice, though well-intentioned, was necessarily limited by their own horizons. This created a psychological challenge that Machiavelli would have recognized: the need to maintain family relationships while pursuing goals that transcend family understanding. The solution to this dilemma lies in Machiavelli's understanding of the relationship between public and private personas. One can maintain respect for family traditions and values while simultaneously pursuing strategies that extend far beyond traditional family boundaries. This requires a sophisticated understanding of communication and relationship management, skills that are essential for anyone seeking to operate effectively in multiple social contexts. Lorenzo's study of Machiavellian principles led him to recognize that successful advancement often requires the ability to speak different languages to different audiences. With his family, he emphasized continuity and respect for tradition. With potential mentors and allies, he emphasized innovation and potential. With competitors, he emphasized collaboration while privately maintaining strategic advantage. This multi-layered approach to communication reflects Machiavelli's understanding that effective leadership requires adaptability and strategic thinking. The second major principle for achieving unprecedented family heights involves the systematic development of capabilities that previous generations lacked. This goes beyond formal education to include the cultivation of strategic thinking, emotional intelligence, communication skills, and what Machiavelli would have called political wisdom. The ability to understand and influence human behavior in complex social environments. Traditional family advancement strategies often focus on developing technical skills within established fields. A craftsman's son learns to be a better craftsman. A merchant's daughter learns to be a more successful merchant. While this approach can lead to incremental improvement, it rarely produces the kind of dramatic advancement that creates new family legacies. Lorenzo recognized that transcending these patterns would require developing entirely new categories of capability. The study of rhetoric, which was central to Renaissance education and which Machiavelli himself had mastered, became a cornerstone of Lorenzo's development strategy. He understood that the ability to persuade, influence, and inspire others was fundamental to achieving significant advancement. This was not simply about becoming a better speaker, but about understanding the psychological and social mechanisms that govern human decision-making. Most members of his family had been straightforward, honest people who said what they meant and expected others to do the same. While these qualities had served them well in their limited contexts, they were insufficient for operating in more complex and competitive environments. Lorenzo spent considerable time studying the great communicators of history, analyzing their techniques and practicing their methods. He learned to frame arguments in ways that appealed to different psychological profiles. He developed the ability to read nonverbal communication and to modify his own presentation based on the responses of others. He practiced storytelling, understanding that humans are fundamentally narrative creatures who respond more powerfully to stories than to abstract arguments. The development of strategic thinking capabilities proved equally important. Machiavelli's approach to analyzing political situations, breaking them down into component parts, understanding the motivations of different actors, anticipating likely responses to various actions, and planning multiple steps ahead, became Lorenzo's template for approaching personal and professional challenges. This systematic approach to strategic thinking was completely foreign to his family's traditional approach, which tended to be more reactive and intuitive. Lorenzo created mental models for understanding complex situations, drawing inspiration from Machiavelli's analysis of successful and unsuccessful leaders throughout history. He learned to identify patterns in human behavior, to recognize recurring strategic challenges, and to develop flexible response strategies that could be adapted to different circumstances. This analytical approach gave him significant advantages in negotiations, career planning, and relationship building. The cultivation of what might be called political intelligence, the ability to understand and navigate complex social and organizational dynamics, represented another significant departure from family tradition. Previous generations had operated primarily within small, relatively simple social structures where relationships were straightforward and roles were clearly defined. Lorenzo recognized that achieving unprecedented heights would require operating effectively in much more complex environments. He studied organizational behavior, learning to identify informal power structures, understand coalition dynamics, and recognize the often hidden motivations that drive individual and group behavior. He learned to build strategic alliances, manage competing interests, and position himself advantageously within existing hierarchies, while simultaneously working to change those hierarchies to his benefit. The development of these capabilities required not just study but practical application. Lorenzo sought out increasingly complex and challenging environments where he could test and refine his skills. He volunteered for leadership roles in professional organizations, participated in community initiatives, and gradually built a reputation as someone who could handle difficult situations and produce results. Each experience provided new insights and opportunities to apply Machiavellian principles in real-world contexts. One of the most challenging aspects of developing these new capabilities was maintaining authenticity while becoming more strategic and sophisticated. Machiavelli himself grappled with this challenge, recognizing that effective leadership sometimes requires behavior that conflicts with personal inclinations or moral preferences. Lorenzo had to learn to be simultaneously genuine and strategic, honest and diplomatic, principled and flexible. The solution lay in Machiavelli's understanding that virtue and effectiveness are not always synonymous. One can maintain core ethical principles while adapting methods and approaches to different situations and audiences. The key is clarity about fundamental values combined with flexibility about tactics and strategies. Lorenzo developed a personal code that honored his family's values while permitting the kind of strategic behavior necessary for significant advancement. This personal evolution was perhaps the most profound aspect of Lorenzo's journey toward achieving unprecedented family heights. It required not just learning new skills but developing a new identity, one that honored his heritage while transcending its limitations. This transformation reflected Machiavelli's understanding that significant achievement often requires fundamental personal change rather than simply applying greater effort to existing approaches. The third and most crucial principle for achieving the pinnacle one's lineage has never reached involves the creation and exploitation of systemic opportunities rather than simply competing within existing systems. This represents the most sophisticated application of Machiavellian thinking and the greatest departure from traditional family advancement strategies. Most people, including most members of Lorenzo's family throughout history, had operated according to what might be called a competitive paradigm. They identified existing opportunities, jobs, educational programs, business ventures, and competed for access to these opportunities. Success was measured by one's ability to outperform others within established frameworks. This approach, while capable of producing modest advancement, is inherently limited because it accepts existing definitions of opportunity and success. Machiavelli's approach was fundamentally different. Rather than simply competing within existing systems, he sought to understand and influence the systems themselves. He recognized that the greatest opportunities often lie not in competing for existing positions, but in creating new positions, new markets, new institutions, and new definitions of value. This systemic approach to advancement requires a much deeper understanding of social, economic, and political dynamics than the traditional competitive approach. Lorenzo's application of this principle began with a careful analysis of the systems and institutions that had defined his family's limitations. He studied the economic structures that had constrained his grandfather's business. He analyzed the educational and professional pathways that had channeled his parents' ambitions. He examined the social networks and cultural assumptions that had shaped his family's understanding of what was possible. This analysis revealed that his family's modest achievements were not simply the result of individual limitations, but were largely determined by systemic factors that could potentially be changed or circumvented. The guild system that had regulated his grandfather's craft, for example, had both protected and limited craftsmen. The educational institutions that had shaped his parents' careers had provided certain opportunities while foreclosing others. The social networks available to his family had offered certain forms of support while limiting access to other forms of influence and opportunity. Understanding these systemic factors allowed Lorenzo to develop strategies that operated at a higher level than traditional competitive approaches. Rather than simply trying to be a better competitor within existing systems, he began looking for ways to create new systems or to position himself advantageously as existing systems evolved. This systemic approach required developing what Machiavelli would have recognized as architectural thinking, the ability to design and build new structures rather than simply operating within existing ones. Lorenzo studied how successful entrepreneurs create new markets, how political leaders build new coalitions, how cultural figures establish new movements, and how institutional leaders develop new organizational forms. One of Lorenzo's most successful applications of this principle involved recognizing an emerging trend before it became widely apparent and positioning himself to benefit as the trend developed. Rather than waiting for new opportunities to be formally announced and then competing for access to them, he learned to identify emerging opportunities while they were still in development and to position himself as an essential participant in their realization. This required developing sophisticated trend analysis capabilities. Lorenzo learned to read weak signals, early indicators of significant changes in technology, society, economics, or politics. He studied the work of futurists and strategic planners, learning to distinguish between superficial changes and fundamental shifts that would create lasting new opportunities. More importantly, he learned to position himself not just as a beneficiary of emerging trends, but as an active participant in shaping them. This reflects one of Machiavelli's most profound insights. that successful leaders do not simply respond to circumstances but actively work to create favorable circumstances. Lorenzo began identifying areas where his emerging capabilities could contribute to developments that were larger than himself but that could ultimately advance his personal and professional objectives. The creation of strategic alliances with other individuals and organizations who shared an interest in particular emerging opportunities became a crucial element of Lorenzo's systemic approach. Rather than operating as an isolated individual competing against others, he learned to identify and cultivate relationships with people whose success would contribute to his own advancement and whose advancement he could support through his own efforts. These alliances were fundamentally different from the traditional networking approaches that his family had practiced. Traditional networking tends to be based on mutual familiarity and general goodwill. Strategic alliance building is based on aligned interests and complementary capabilities. Lorenzo learned to identify people whose goals and capabilities created natural opportunities for collaboration and mutual advancement. The development and management of these strategic alliances required sophisticated relationship-building skills that went far beyond traditional social networking. Lorenzo had to learn to identify potential allies, understand their motivations and objectives, develop compelling value propositions for collaboration, and maintain productive relationships over extended periods while circumstances and objectives evolved. This approach to relationship building reflected Machiavelli's understanding that political success depends heavily on the ability to build and maintain coalitions of support. Lorenzo applied this insight to his personal advancement strategy, recognizing that achieving unprecedented heights would require not just individual effort, but the support and collaboration of others who could benefit from his success. Perhaps most importantly, Lorenzo learned to think systemically about reputation and influence. Rather than simply trying to build a good reputation within existing contexts, he worked to establish himself as a thought leader and influencer within emerging contexts. This required not just demonstrating competence within existing frameworks, but contributing to the development of new frameworks. Lorenzo began writing and speaking about trends and opportunities that he had identified through his systemic analysis. He positioned himself as an expert on emerging developments rather than simply as a participant in existing activities. This thought leadership approach allowed him to build influence and recognition within developing fields rather than having to compete for recognition within established fields where others already held dominant positions. The creation of new value propositions became a central element of Lorenzo's strategy. Rather than simply offering traditional services or products more efficiently or effectively than competitors, he learned to identify unmet needs and develop innovative approaches to addressing them. This required understanding not just what people currently wanted, but what they might want as circumstances changed and new possibilities emerged. This innovation-oriented approach reflected Machiavelli's understanding that lasting success often requires changing the rules of the game rather than simply playing existing games more effectively. Lorenzo learned to identify assumptions and practices that were widely accepted but potentially vulnerable to challenge or improvement. He developed the ability to envision and articulate alternative approaches that could provide superior results. The implementation of these alternative approaches required not just conceptual innovation, but practical execution capabilities. Lorenzo had to learn project management, resource mobilization, and change management skills that allowed him to translate innovative ideas into operational realities. This required understanding not just what should be done, but how to actually accomplish complex objectives in real-world environments with limited resources and multiple constraints. Risk management became a crucial element of Lorenzo's systemic approach. Machiavelli understood that bold action necessarily involves risk, but he also recognized that calculated risks are fundamentally different from reckless gambles. Lorenzo learned to analyze and manage risks systematically, developing contingency plans and maintaining multiple options, rather than betting everything on single approaches. This sophisticated approach to risk management allowed Lorenzo to pursue much more ambitious objectives than would have been possible using traditional risk-averse family strategies. Rather than avoiding risk, he learned to understand, quantify, and manage risk in ways that allowed him to pursue high-potential opportunities while maintaining acceptable levels of security. The measurement and adjustment of progress became essential elements of Lorenzo's systemic approach. Rather than simply working hard and hoping for the best, he developed systematic methods for tracking his advancement toward long-term objectives and adjusting his strategies based on results and changing circumstances. This required developing both quantitative and qualitative metrics for assessing progress toward unprecedented achievement. Traditional family measures of success, steady employment, modest savings, social respectability, Lorenzo had to develop new measures that reflected his expanded ambitions and sophisticated strategies. The psychological and emotional dimensions of pursuing unprecedented achievement proved to be among the most challenging aspects of Lorenzo's journey. Moving beyond family patterns of modest achievement required not just new strategies but fundamental changes in identity, relationships, and worldview. The isolation that often accompanies significant departures from family traditions created ongoing emotional challenges. While Lorenzo maintained loving relationships with his family members, he increasingly found that his experiences, objectives, and ways of thinking were difficult for them to understand or fully support. This created a form of loneliness that successful people throughout history have experienced but that is rarely discussed openly. Managing this isolation required developing new forms of community and support. Lorenzo learned to build relationships with other individuals who were pursuing similarly ambitious objectives and who could understand the challenges and opportunities associated with transcending traditional limitations. These relationships provided emotional support as well as practical collaboration opportunities. The development of psychological resilience became crucial for sustaining long-term effort toward unprecedented objectives. The pursuit of goals that one's family has never achieved necessarily involves venturing into unknown territory where failure is always possible and where traditional support systems may be inadequate. Lorenzo had to develop internal resources for maintaining motivation and confidence, despite setbacks and uncertainty. This psychological development reflected Machiavelli's understanding that leadership requires inner strength and self-reliance as well as strategic intelligence. Teddy. The ability to persist in the face of obstacles, to maintain optimism despite temporary failures, and to continue learning and adapting when initial approaches prove inadequate, became essential elements of Lorenzo's character development. The integration of family values with unprecedented achievement required careful attention to maintaining core ethical principles while adapting methods and strategies to new environments and challenges. Lorenzo had to find ways to honor his family's emphasis on honesty, hard work, and integrity, while also developing the sophisticated strategic capabilities necessary for significant advancement. This integration process reflected Machiavelli's understanding that effective leadership requires balancing competing values and considerations rather than simply optimizing for single variables. Lorenzo learned to maintain ethical principles as fundamental constraints while maximizing achievement within those constraints. This approach allowed him to pursue ambitious objectives without compromising the family values that remained important to his identity and relationships. The culmination of Lorenzo's journey toward achieving unprecedented family heights came not through a single dramatic breakthrough, but through the accumulated impact of systematic application of Machiavellian principles over an extended period. The combination of strategic thinking, capability development, systemic opportunity creation, and psychological resilience gradually produced results that far exceeded anything his family had previously achieved. More importantly, Lorenzo's success created new possibilities for future generations of his family. By demonstrating that traditional limitations could be transcended through strategic thinking and systematic effort, he established new expectations and new pathways for family members who would follow. His achievements became part of the family narrative, expanding the definition of what was possible and providing models and resources for continued advancement. The transformation of family potential through individual achievement represents one of the most profound applications of Machiavellian wisdom. By understanding and applying principles of power, influence, and strategic thinking, individuals can break generational patterns of limitation and create new trajectories of advancement that benefit not just themselves but their entire lineage. Lorenzo's story illustrates that achieving the pinnacle one's lineage has never reached is not simply a matter of working harder or being more talented than previous generations. It requires fundamental changes in thinking, strategy, and approach. It demands the development of new capabilities, the creation of new opportunities, and the courage to venture beyond the comfortable boundaries of family tradition. The application of Machiavellian wisdom to personal advancement offers a framework for understanding and implementing these necessary changes. By studying power dynamics, developing strategic thinking capabilities, building influential relationships, and creating systemic opportunities, individuals can transcend inherited limitations and achieve unprecedented heights. The legacy of such achievement extends far beyond individual success. When someone breaks through generational barriers and reaches new pinnacles of achievement, they create new possibilities for their entire family line. They demonstrate that limitations once thought to be fixed can actually be transcended. They provide models, resources, and inspiration for future generations who can build upon their achievements to reach even greater heights. This transformative potential represents the ultimate application of Machiavellian wisdom, not just the achievement of personal power and influence, but the creation of lasting change that expands possibilities for others. By understanding and applying these principles, individuals can become architects of their family's future rather than simply inheritors of their family's past. The journey from modest family origins to unprecedented achievement is challenging and complex, requiring sustained effort, sophisticated thinking, and considerable courage. But as Lorenzo's story demonstrates, it is entirely possible for those who are willing to study, learn, and apply the timeless principles of strategic thinking and systematic advancement that Machiavelli so brilliantly articulated centuries ago. Stand. The pinnacle that one's lineage has never reached is not a destination but a departure point, the beginning of a new trajectory that can continue to ascend through future generations. By achieving unprecedented heights, individuals do not just change their own lives but transform the entire future potential of their family line. This is perhaps the greatest application of Machiavellian wisdom. The understanding that strategic thinking and systematic action can create lasting change that extends far beyond individual achievement to reshape the destiny of entire lineages. In the end, Lorenzo's success was not measured simply by his personal accomplishments, significant though they were. It was measured by the transformation he had created in his family's understanding of what was possible. Future generations would grow up with expanded expectations, greater resources, and proven models for achieving significant advancement. The modest craftsman's family had become something unprecedented, a lineage of achievement that could continue to reach new heights for generations to come. The principles that guided this transformation remain as relevant today as they were in Machiavelli's time. The fundamental dynamics of power, influence, and strategic thinking that shape human advancement continue to operate in contemporary contexts. Those who study and apply these principles with wisdom and persistence can achieve their own unprecedented heights, creating new possibilities not just for themselves, but for all those who will follow in their footsteps. The pinnacle your lineage has never reached awaits those who have the courage to pursue it and the wisdom to understand how such heights can be achieved. Machiavelli's insights provide the roadmap. Individual determination and strategic application provide the means. The only question that remains is whether you will accept the limitations inherited from previous generations, or whether you will rise to create new possibilities that will inspire and enable future achievements for generations to come.